I'd like to start with a few words in Palawakani, the Tasmanian Aboriginal language. If you go to the summit of Kunyanyi, Mount Wellington, you'll see on the interpretive material these four words: Waranta Palawa Miletana Nika. We are this country is us, which I think challenges us because it inverts the idea of tenure, that we belong to the land rather than the other way around. So in that spirit, I want to address this topic. Regenerative agriculture, buzzword or game changer? Now the short answer to that question is both. So what I want to suggest to you is that regenerative agriculture offers great promise to Australian agriculture, especially in areas with low or variable rainfall and especially in the face of climate change. But it also, like the term sustainability and resilience, is open to misappropriation and misuse. It's already being used in product differentiation and marketing with very little relevance to the underlying principles. And so what I want to do is three things in this talk. Firstly, to outline what sits under that broad umbrella of regenerative agriculture in Australia today. Secondly, I want to trace its origins, and its roots go right back to the same time as the origins of industrial agriculture. So it has a 200-year history. Two very different phenomena, one in the formal culture, one almost subterranean or subversive that I would say is beginning to emerge. And lastly, I want to just provide a couple of examples of how already the term is being misused or misappropriated, and it will be to a greater extent, one from America and one from Australia. Let's start with the first part. What is regenerative agriculture? It is both a social movement and a collection of practices, and that collection of practices includes organic, biodynamic agriculture, holistic grazing management, natural sequence farming, keyline farming. I'll say a little bit about all of these, some which originated in Europe, some which are the product of homegrown Mavericks who've been trying different things. At its essence though, ecologically, it has three main principles. One is to tighten the cycles of water and nutrients. So in conventional industrial agriculture, we've tended to hotwire the landscape with water and nutrients, and they flow through the landscape rather than relying on biological processes for cycling. The other is to improve the capture and use of solar energy. And the third is to do that with increased functional biodiversity. Now I should explain what I mean by functional biodiversity. You can think of biodiversity in three terms: composition, what's there; structure, how it's arranged; and function, what it does. At the moment in our law, in our regulations, in federal and state law, we elect to use the easily interpreted definitions, which is composition and structure, because we can define them. We can define what a species is, we can class it as rare and endangered, we can define structure in terms of grassland, woodland, forest, wetland. Function escapes us. If you search for indices of functional biodiversity, you'll find about 22 candidates at the moment. It's something that we cannot, because we can't nail it down in legal language, it eludes us. But within regenerative agriculture, what matters is what species do, not where they come from or how rare they are. And so often it runs contrary to conservation principles or ideas because it involves exotic and endemic species. So the three ecological principles again were tightening cycles of water and nutrients, capture of solar energy, achieving that through functional biodiversity. As well as that, in a social sense, it's improving quality of life. And in an economic sense, it's stable income, getting away from the boom and bust pattern of income of most farmers. Its most recent incarnation has been in a form that's called holistic grazing management. And that does have its origins in the work of a South African botanist and a French scientist. The South African botanist was a man called John Acox, who famously said of South Africa, it is understocked and overgrazed. And what he's really saying is we have too few animals that we keep in the same place all the time, and they eat the vegetation down to the quick, and it erodes and all the consequences that follow. The Frenchman was a biochemist called André Voisin, who wrote a book called Grassland Productivity, which has since been translated into 18 languages. It's still in print, but it's not really recognised even in the French Academy or many others. His principle was you manage grazing animals by managing the grass, you look at the condition of the grass, not the animal. So you maintain cover, you maintain diversity, you maintain structural diversity, you maintain functional diversity, as in root morphology, whether it's deep, shallow, whether summer active, winter active. So physiologically, anatomically, phenologically, you're looking for diversity and you maintain that diversity. If you look after that, and by inference the soil, you can look after your animals. A man called Alan Savory read both of the work of those two scientists, combined it with his observation of how animals in the African savannah graze, which is large mobs coming through quickly, eating everything and moving on, or not quite everything. And then he came out with a book in 1988 called Holistic Management. And that has spurned a movement in Australia. And that is its most recognisable form. And that is, what's now happening is a bunch of different practices are coalescing under this general umbrella of regenerative agriculture. And I'll say a bit more about them in a minute. But to go back to its origins, it plays out in a way like a dramatic tragedy. You have on the one side human cleverness and the application of science, kicked off about 200 years ago, and you have the origins of organic biodynamic and these other forms of agriculture initiated at about the same time in reaction to that. So let me give you a very brief dramatis personae of those involved. And it starts in Germany in about 1840, if we think of industrial agriculture, with a man called Justus von Liebig, who was the father of organic chemistry and the person who came up with the principle called the law of the minimum. And what he was really saying about productivity and fertility of agriculture, it's not just a function of the fertility of the soil and the climate and the other resources, it's dependent on what is the most limiting factor. Particularly in the case of the major nutrients, minor nutrients and trace elements, and that really kick-started the whole fertiliser industry. If we fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century, we have two other Germans, Karl Bosch and Fritz Haber, who developed the Haber-Bosch process, which now uses 1% of the total fossil fuel energy consumption of the planet. And it's a process that drags nitrogen out of the atmosphere and makes it available as fertiliser. So it does, at hundreds of degrees centigrade and several atmospheres pressure, what bacteria do in the nodules of peas and beans and other legumes at ambient temperature and 1 atmosphere pressure. But it has, so it's claimed, managed to lift over 30 million people out of poverty in the 20th century through the production of synthetic fertiliser. Another name that's closely associated with that application of human cleverness and scientific method to agriculture or to food productivity was Norman Borlaug, who is the face behind the Green Revolution. And what he put together was a package of varieties of wheat and rice, high yielding, short, with a combination of fertiliser and pesticides that particularly had an impact in South and East Asia. As an example, before the Green Revolution, India was a net importer of food. Last year, India exported $47 billion worth of food. That's a very simplistic equation, and there is still much analysis about the unintended social and economic consequences of the Green Revolution, but it's undeniable it has contributed a lot to alleviating human poverty and famine. So you realise it's a very broad brush analysis, but if we take that as one side, at about the same time as Justus von Liebig was working in organic chemistry, there was a man called Johann Goethe, who was a polymath, a poet, a writer, a playwright, but he also had his own philosophy of science, which was phenomenological. It was experiential. It was not limited to our ability to measure and categorise bits of nature in small pieces. It was very much about human interaction and experience, and he kind of preempted what is now called social ecological systems in the way he looked at it. So why is he significant? He was the person who inspired Rudolf Steiner to begin the biodynamic movement. So that began also in the early decades of the 20th century. It covers a minuscule area of the Earth's surface in terms of agriculture, but it has been very, very influential, and you'll find prominent Tasmanian growers particularly winemakers who use biodynamic principles. They're perfectly happy with the metaphysics of Goethe and Rudolf Steiner, as well as using the very latest equipment in their viticulture and in their wine production. And that is, if I race towards where we're headed, it's the marriage between the two that we're particularly interested within the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture and in our research. But at the moment, they sit as two quite separate cultures. Another person who's very influential is an English agricultural science, Albert Howard, who wrote an agricultural testament. After he graduated in agricultural science, he went and worked in India and then the Caribbean, and he came back saying, look, I think there are things that traditional farmers are doing that we could incorporate into our methods. And he particularly influenced a woman called Eve Balfour, who was the first woman to graduate in agricultural science from a British university. And the first thing she did is go back to the farm and convert it to organic, and it remains the longest running comparison between organic and conventional farming in the world. And she wrote a book called The Living Soil, published in 1945, and started the Soil Association of Great Britain, which is still alive and well, still active, and is the foundation for organic farming movement in Britain. In 1958, she spent a year touring Australia, including time in Tasmania, and inspired a man called Henry Shoebridge from the Derwent Valley to form the Tasmanian Soil Association, which at the time was the only other soil association outside Britain. If we go over the Atlantic to the US, there's a man called John Rodale who started the Rodale Institute, which is still running, and it was his son Robert that first used the term regenerative agriculture in 1980. So it's been around for 40 years, but what we see now is a range of different alternatives to conventional agriculture coalescing under that heading. And I just want to run through a few Australian Mavericks who've come up with their own solution that have very much influenced where we are now. A man called P.A. Yeomans from the Kiewa Valley was a clearing contractor, bulldozer driver. He had a farm and he looked at the way water was running off the landscape and decided we could do a lot better, and put out a book called Water for Every Farm, which is still in print and has had a significant influence outside Australia as well as in. And you may be wondering why, what has this got to do with water? And I think the significant factor in Australia is that much of the Australian landscape and its vegetation evolved to live for significant periods of time on water that is below the surface, in the soil, in aquifers and in floodplains. And we did not know what we were doing when we introduced European agriculture, because we did not know what we were undoing. And the changes we've made to the hydrology have been profound. And just as management of the Murray-Darling Basin is not a matter of water accounting or a water trading challenge, it's a whole of landscape challenge. So is management of water in our landscapes and the preservation of our rivers and streams. We have an excellent resource in Tasmania in the WIST, the Water Information System of Tasmania, that's maintained by Department of Primary Industry. If you go and have a look at just about every single river in an agricultural catchment in Tasmania, you'll see this slow but inexorable decline in water quality. That's the relevance of what I'm saying to water. A couple of other mavericks, Alex Podolinsky was a refugee from the Second World War, Polish, who introduced biodynamic farming to Australia, and in 1980 started publishing a series of essays on biodynamic farming. Bill Mollison, who was a lecturer in geography at this university, in 1980 came out with his ideas on permaculture. Peter Andrews, you might have heard of, was a farmer from the Hunter Valley who developed what he called natural sequence farming, which in essence is rehydrating floodplains. He looked at most river systems in agricultural landscapes in Australia and realised they'd been channelized. Instead of a chain of ponds, they'd been cut through, and what that did is it prevented flooding, but it also eliminated one of the major water storages in the landscape, which is water stored below the surface in floodplains. What he's done to the irritation of the authorities is use exotic species and dams to slow the river down, recreate these chains of ponds and rehydrate the floodplain. Cole Seiss is an interesting farmer from New South Wales who lost his house, his farm, most of his machinery in a bushfire. In desperation to get something in to feed his sheep, he borrowed a neighbour's equipment and planted an oat crop directly into a native grass, a stand of Danthonia, wallaby grass. And to his surprise, he got a good crop of oats, and when the oats was harvested and the Danthonia came out of its dormancy, so winter active oats, summer active native grass, he got an excellent stand of pasture. So he's developed what he calls pasture cropping. He travels the world talking about this, And this is a case of complementary phenology, mixing a winter active annual with a summer active perennial. It's worked well, and it conforms with one of the primary principles of regenerative agriculture is no bare soil, keep the ground covered. And finally, I'll end with Charles Massey, who I think we can attribute or we can credit with the fact that the term regenerative agriculture is now in the popular consciousness. At the age of 60, he went back to university, did a PhD, which was to go and interview about 30 or 40 farmers doing radically different things in Australia, and published a book called Call of the Reed Warbler. In that, he's really laid down these principles of regenerative agriculture. And let me finish by saying this, that on the 3rd and 4th of June this year, the University of Tasmania hosted the first national conference on regenerative agriculture at our campus in Launceston. It was run entirely by a group called RANT, which I think is very appropriate, the Regenerative Agriculture Network of Tasmania. They ran the conference. It was all farmers, practitioners on the program, 189 attendees, of which 181 were farmers. I just want to finish with a couple of, I suppose, alerts or incidents of where I think it's beginning to be misappropriated. General Mills, the company that makes Cheerios, Haagen-Dazs, Yoplait, in March this year they came out and said they're going to sponsor the conversion of 400,000 hectares or acres, hectares of farmland in America to regenerative practices. When you dig a bit deeper, what they're doing is they have a stream of GMO-free breakfast cereals, and they're now going to brand them GMO and regenerative. And it would appear to be the extent to which it is genuine, to the extent to which it's motivated by marketing is dubious. Another one is Wide Open Agriculture, which is an Australian company that recently floated on the Australian Stock Exchange. If you look at its current business, it's protected cropping of tomatoes and capsicum. So this is tunnel houses. And yet on their website they say that they purchase land through innovative financing platforms and partner with regenerative farmers. There's very little there that tells you that it aligns in any way with the principles I've just described. So I think one thing we need to be wary of is when you hear the term, dig a little deeper. But I'm hoping I've conveyed something of the intent or the principles behind it and some of its history. And our interest at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture is to work with some of these practitioners to try and find a marriage between those two cultures which have so far been travelling in parallel, the idea of human cleverness and the application of science and the desire for naturalness. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Any questions for Ted? Phoebe?
I was wondering, have you done much work, have you heard much about Indigenous, like native plants and food? I've heard a few things lately about grains and whatnot. Is that happening on a larger scale, or do you think that will happen on a larger scale?
It's certainly not happening on a large scale. I did do a bit of work into a native grass called Microlena stipoides, which is called weeping rice grass. And what triggered my interest was seeing a collection, and some of the accessions from mid-north coast of New South Wales had extraordinarily large seeds, almost the size of rice, which led me to think that some selection might have gone on. So we made a collection up and down the east coast and in Western Australia, and we looked at the variation within that species and went to the Grains Research and Development Corporation and said, here, I think we've got an Indigenous plant that has potential. And they sat us down and said, listen, do you know how many plants have entered the human food system in the last 200 years? Novel plants. And the obstacles to doing it were such that they wouldn't further that research. But if you're interested in this, I would strongly encourage you to read a book called Dark Emu Black Seeds by Bruce Pascoe, which you've probably heard about. And he cites that work we did on Microlena in that. There are some people working on Dioscorea, the yams that are native to a lot of Western District of Victoria. I think a lot of the focus on Indigenous foods at the moment is essentially garnish, not staple. And when we get to high carbohydrate rich and nutrient-dense foods like grains and yams and tubers, then we're seriously talking about Indigenous food, and I think that's yet to come.
So I'd like to sort of hear a little bit about the financial side of it. Obviously, regenerative agriculture makes good sense. You must have examples of situations where there's an economic advantage as well.
There's not good evidence. There's a couple of studies, but what tends to come out of them is that it takes the peaks and troughs out, but you're not going to be a millionaire. So in other words, when I was training in agricultural science, the rule of thumb for a farmer in the wheat sheep belt of Western Australia was you would make a profit in 3 years out of 10, you'd break even in 3. Oh no, you'd make a profit in 3, you'd break even in 4, and you'd make a loss in 3. So you had to be ready for those good years. And what we typically see is high levels of indebtedness, declining terms of trade, financial hardship. One thing that getting off that train regenerative agriculture does, it's a low input, low output system. You have to lower your expectations about wealth, but at least it's relatively stable.
Andrew, just a question around here.
Thanks, Ted. Is anyone looking at these principles outside of a purely agricultural sense, so that applying the same principles to, say, cities and rural res? Because there's a lot of those areas in Tasmania that I think would benefit from having the same principles applied to them.
Good question. What was the second part in terms of cities and?
Rural residential kind of blocks that people own.
I don't know. I'm thinking that they sort of run in parallel with a lot of ideas about sustainability, particularly the idea about, if you heard Jason this morning talking about, I think it was closed loop metabolism, circular economy. So yes, come to think of it, some of the same principles apply, and there is actually a movement that started in the Huon Valley called Circular Economy Huon, where a group of citizens are working with the council on seeing how they can apply some of those principles to a number of different industries and activities within the Huon Valley. So yeah, if you look up circular economy, I think you'll find that there's parallels there at a larger scale.
Thanks.
Ted, if I may, sorry to surprise you. Just one last question. Noting the principles from, I think it was South Africa, around don't look at the condition of the stock, look at the condition of the land. Yeah. And so we have a capacity in the land, and that's been informed by wild grazing animals moving across that land. So that's a certain paradigm. We have a large global population that wants to eat a lot of meat, ideally less so, but can we marry those two things in terms of the condition of the land and the regenerative practice and the sheer volume in terms of feeding the population of the planet?
Yeah, that is a challenging one, but I think it's worth considering that the population is currently at about 7 billion, and if you look at the UN projections, is expected to peak sometime this century around 10 or 11 billion. At the moment, there's about 1 billion people in Europe, 1 billion people in North and South America, about 2 billion in Asia and 1 billion in Africa. Asia is projected to increase by another billion to 4 billion. Africa is expected to double. This may be false hope, but there's still enormous agricultural potential within Africa. That's one answer, is that the pressure is coming off in terms of population growth. The growth rate of the human population has been slowing since the 1980s. So the rate has been slowing, the absolute numbers are going up. So that pressure is coming up, and whole new areas are developing within Africa. But it's got to be multi-pronged. It's got to be change in diet as well as change in practice. And I agree, we are looking at slightly lower levels of productivity, maybe considerably. And I have a vigorous debating companion on the northwest coast who works in high production dairy systems who will have none of this. But then what I remind him is when they did a nitrogen balance of Tasmanian dairy farms in the northwest recently, when they did it 20 years ago, there was 50 kilos per hectare of unaccounted for nitrogen. That's elemental nitrogen. So by looking at all the total feed, fertiliser coming onto the farm and the milk and animals leaving the farm, there was 50 kilos per hectare unaccounted for, most of which was going down into the soil and into the rivers. They repeated that 2 years ago, and the figure is 154 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So we've got to get on top of that. So somewhere there has to be a compromise.
So, thank you, Ted. On that note, the fascinating talk, really great historic context and feed into a critical practice and change in practice that we need for global sustainability, and really appreciate it. And if you could please thank Ted for his talk this morning.
Okay. Thank you.